might have stopped by the gas station.
He couldn't accept who she was, so he decided she couldn't live. In the cold dark of a Washington forest, police pushed through the undergrowth, their flashlights cutting through shadows that hide more than just trees. Somewhere out there is the answer to a mother's worst nightmare. 17-year-old Nikki Kuhnhausen, bright, bold, and unafraid to be herself, had vanished after a night out. What happened in those missing hours would expose a secret and unleash a deadly choice. This is the story of a teenager whose life was stolen in one night, and the law that now carries her name. The text messages, the drive, the moment everything changed. Stay with me, because the truth isn't what you think. Vancouver, Washington, a place where the winters are grey, the coffee is strong, and everyone seems to know someone you know. For Nikki Kuhnhausen, this was home. The streets, the school hallways, the late-night diners, they were all part of the world she navigated with an easy confidence. She was the kind of person who could walk into a room of strangers and somehow leave with friends. Her laughter had a way of cutting through the noise, bright, sharp, unforgettable. People noticed her, not because she demanded attention, but because she made being herself look effortless. But Nikki's confidence didn't come without a fight. From a young age she learned that not everyone was ready to accept her for who she was. Growing up transgender in a small city meant she carried more than just school books. She carried other people's opinions, whispers and stares. Her friends say she handled it with a kind of grace they didn't always understand. A makeup brush in one hand, a phone in the other, she could turn an insult into a joke and move on before anyone could see it hurt. She had dreams bigger than Vancouver, and she wasn't afraid to say them out loud. At school she had a flair for style, colorful nails, hair that changed with her moods, and outfits that made her stand out against the Northwest's constant backdrop of rain clouds. She posted selfies without hesitation, each one a statement, "This is me." Her mother remembers late nights in the kitchen, the two of them talking about everything, from the kind of apartment Nikki wanted in Los Angeles, to the music she'd play if she ever had her own fashion show. Those were the dreams she clung to. That was the life she was building. Still, there were moments she didn't talk about, times when a text would come in and her smile would tighten, when she'd leave a party early without saying why. Her closest friends noticed it. They say she didn't always know who she could trust. She didn't like to dwell on it, at least not out loud, but there was something in the way she'd glance over her shoulder in certain places. It's those moments, quiet, fleeting, that stay with you when you're looking back. When you're wondering how the story could have ended differently. She lived like the world couldn't touch her. But the truth is, danger doesn't always come with a warning. She thought she knew the people in her world. She didn't. It started the way so many connections do now, not in a coffee shop or on a street corner, but through the glow of a phone screen. On an early summer evening in 2019, Nikki was scrolling through her social media feed. Photos, messages, comments from friends. Familiar faces mixed with new ones. Somewhere in that mix, a name appeared that she didn't recognize, David Bogdanov. They weren't complete strangers, friends of friends, people in the same local circles. Vancouver isn't a big city. It's the kind of place where one introduction can turn into 3 more by the end of the night. David was 25, older than most of the people Nikki spent time with. He worked in construction, drove a white van, and moved between jobs around the city. To Nikki, he was just another connection, someone who seemed friendly enough, someone who'd been vouched for by people she knew. The first message was simple, casual, no pressure, just a hello, the kind you send to see if someone will bite. Over the next few days the conversation grew. They talked about the usual, music, places they'd been, where they liked to hang out. His tone was easy, even charming. To anyone watching from the outside it would have seemed harmless. But behind those messages, David was curious. He wanted to meet in person. Nikki didn't think twice. Meeting up with people through mutual friends wasn't unusual for her, especially in the summer, when nights stretched long and plans could change with a single text. By the end of that week, the idea was set. He'd give her a ride. They'd hang out. No one in Nikki's life had a reason to see danger in it. Not yet. A conversation turned into a plan for a ride that would never bring her home. Just after midnight, the white van pulled up. Nikki climbed inside. The street was quiet, lit only by the orange wash of street lamps. Neighbors slept. The city felt still. From that moment on, there were no more posts, no more messages, just silence, and the faint echo of a closing door. Where they went next, and what happened in those missing hours, would become the center of a case that shook the community and changed the law forever. It was a little after midnight when Nikki climbed into David Bogdanov's van. The city was quiet, the streets empty except for the occasional passing car. According to investigators, that was the last time anyone would see her in familiar surroundings. What happened over the next few hours would be stitched together later, not from one clear video, not from a single witness, but from fragments, a handful of sightings, digital breadcrumbs, a patchwork of the truth. The first clue came from a witness, a friend who had been messaging Nikki earlier in the night. She said Nikki seemed in good spirits, casual, almost excited. Nothing in her tone suggested fear. She didn't say where she was going, only that she had a ride. From there, investigators turned to technology. Nikki's phone connected briefly to a tower on the east side of Vancouver. Minutes later, a second ping, farther out, near a commercial district. It was just enough to place her in motion, heading away from the neighborhood she knew best. Another piece came from a grainy CCTV camera mounted outside a 24-hour convenience store. The timestamp, 12:43 a.m. A white van rolls past in the background. It doesn't stop. Investigators would later compare that image to David's vehicle. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to raise questions. Around the same time, another camera, this one on the edge of a parking lot, caught a brief blurry shot of a figure in the passenger seat. The angle was bad, the face was impossible to make out, but the shape, the hair, it could have been Nikki. The trail continued in short bursts. Another cell tower ping, this time pulling them farther east, toward the outskirts of the city. Past the streetlights, past the places still awake at that hour. Back on her phone, the activity slowed, fewer notifications. Then, one last post, a selfie, the timestamp, 1:02 a.m. She's wearing makeup, her hair tucked into a beanie. She's smiling, tilting her head slightly toward the camera. It's the kind of photo that says, "I'm okay." No one knew it would be the last image she'd ever send. Hours later, she would vanish. No calls, no replies. The phone that had been her constant link to the world went dark. Somewhere between those pings and that silence, everything had changed, and no one, not her friends, not her family, knew it yet. The timeline puts them somewhere east of the city by the early hours of the morning. The roads out there are different, fewer lights, fewer witnesses, just long stretches of asphalt, broken by the occasional gas station or turn-off into the woods. What was said in that van? Only two people knew, and one of them would never speak again. Investigators believe it was during this drive that David Bogdanov learned something about Nikki, something that should never have been a secret, but in that moment, it became the trigger for everything that followed. According to prosecutors, it was then he realized Nikki was transgender. The details of how that came up, whether it was a conversation, a slip, a reveal, are unclear. But what's certain is that the tone shifted. The ride that began casually was now tense, fractured. What happened next, no one heard. But the evidence would speak for her. There were no 911 calls, no messages to friends saying she felt unsafe, just silence. Cell tower data later showed the van moving toward an even more remote area. No cameras, no street lamps, just the darkness of the Washington backroads. At trial, prosecutors argued that what should have been a moment of understanding became a moment of rage, that instead of acceptance, David chose violence, and that choice, they said, was rooted in prejudice. David would claim later that he felt shocked, that he reacted out of instinct. But the law doesn't excuse instinct when it costs someone their life. And this instinct left a 17-year-old girl missing. From that point on, every step David took would be to erase the hours that had just happened. But the truth has a way of leaving traces. When Nikki's phone went silent, no one noticed right away. It was summer, and 17-year-olds don't always answer every text. Sometimes, a night out turned into an all-nighter with friends. Sometimes she'd sleep in until the afternoon. But this time, it was different. By mid-morning, her mom had sent her a message, just checking in, no reply. Another message, still nothing. Hours passed, and the silence began to feel heavy. Her mom knew Nikki's patterns, when she'd post, who she'd talk to first, how she'd call if she needed a ride. This wasn't like her. And for a mother, that kind of silence sets off alarms you can't ignore. That evening, the worry became action. Her mom picked up the phone and called the Vancouver Police Department. She reported Nikki missing, gave them her last known location, her friends' names, and the time of her last post. She told them about the ride, the white van, and the man named David. The officer on the other end took it down, asked the standard questions, and opened the file. But in the early hours of a disappearance, even the most urgent cases start as just that, a file, a set of notes waiting for movement. Investigators began by tracing her phone activity. The last ping was recorded in the early hours of the morning, on the eastern edge of the city, not near her home, not near any of her usual hangouts, just an unfamiliar stretch of road leading toward the mountains. From there, her digital footprint stopped cold. No outgoing texts, no calls, no social media activity. The girl who lived online as much as she did in person had gone completely dark. Detectives reached out to her friends, piecing together fragments of her last day. They confirmed the plan to meet David. Some remembered seeing her post that final selfie. Others had no idea she'd even left with him. The stories overlapped in pieces, but the middle was missing. Surveillance footage was pulled from nearby businesses. Cameras caught her in the city. And then nothing. Like a thread that simply unraveled into the dark. For her mother, each hour that passed without news felt longer than the one before. Nights blurred into mornings. Every sound outside the window made her wonder if Nikki was coming home, or if she'd never hear her daughter's voice again. Somewhere between those mountains and the city, Nikki was gone. By the second day of Nikki's disappearance, detectives knew they weren't dealing with a simple case of a teenager who'd gone off the radar. Her phone had been silent for more than 24 hours. No posts, no pings, no movement on her accounts. For someone as connected as Nikki, that was a red flag they couldn't ignore. They started where every modern investigation begins, the digital trail. Her phone records showed the last calls she made, the last texts she sent. Every timestamp was a breadcrumb, leading them through the final hours of her life. The last known signal from her phone had bounced off a tower east of Vancouver, near a stretch of highway that wound into the hills. That tower didn't service many homes, just scattered businesses, warehouses, and open land. Beyond it, nothing. It was as if her phone had vanished into thin air. From there, they dug into her social media. They saw the final selfie, time-stamped and geotagged, and began cross-referencing it with her messages. In the hours before she disappeared, Nikki had been chatting with multiple friends. She told a few of them she was meeting someone. She named him David. Detectives began interviewing everyone in her circle. Friends described David as an older guy who'd been hanging around recently. They said Nikki didn't know him well, just through mutual connections. Some remembered her mentioning he was giving her a ride that night. Others admitted they didn't like the idea of her leaving with him. The more detectives learned, the more one name kept coming up. David Bogdanov. They ran his name, no outstanding warrants, no violent history on paper, but he was the last person known to have seen Nikki alive. When police reached out to speak with him, David agreed to meet. His tone was polite, cooperative. He said he'd picked Nikki up, but claimed they'd argued, and that he'd dropped her off in the early hours, alive, near a friend's house. When pressed for details, the story wavered. One version placed her near a park, another mentioned a different street. Timelines shifted. His memory seemed clear in some parts, and strangely vague in others. Detectives compared his statements to the phone data. Things didn't line up. The places he claimed to have been didn't match the routes suggested by cell tower records. Inconsistencies began to pile up, each one a small fracture in his story. Behind closed doors, David Bogdanov went from a name on a witness list to the prime person of interest in Nikki Kuhnhausen's disappearance. And while he walked free, detectives knew time was against them. Evidence fades, memories blur, but the truth, somewhere, was still waiting to be found. For months, the trail had been cold. Leads came and went. Tips fizzled out. Nikki's mother hung on to the smallest signs, hoping they meant her daughter was still alive somewhere. But behind the scenes, detectives feared the truth was moving further out of reach. Then, on June 5, 2020, 6 months after Nikki vanished, a phone call came into the Vancouver Police Department. Hikers had stumbled across something in a remote wooded area on Larch Mountain. It wasn't much at first, just what looked like fabric, tangled in the brush. Officers hiked in, the air still and heavy. It was the kind of forest where sound doesn't travel far, where the light filters in only in broken pieces. Yellow tape went up. Evidence markers were placed in a slow, methodical line, each one leading deeper into the trees. And then, they found her. 6 months later, they found her. The remains were partially concealed, weathered by time and the elements. Nearby, detectives recovered a length of cord, worn, frayed, and unmistakably tied into a makeshift ligature. The coroner's report would later confirm what investigators already suspected. Nikki had died from strangulation. Her final moments were not peaceful. the marks on her bones, the position of the ligature, all told a story she could no longer speak herself. From there, detectives began the painstaking process of reconstructing her last hours. They matched the cell tower data with David Bogdanov's phone records, aligning them with the route toward Larch Mountain. They charted the exact time her phone went dark. They placed the white van in proximity to the site where her body was found. Every piece of evidence brought the picture into sharper focus. The argument in the van, the sudden detour out of the city, the final drive into the woods. Prosecutors believed she was killed within hours of leaving with David. Her body left in the forest, far from the roads where anyone might find her. The discovery changed everything. What had been a missing persons case was now a homicide investigation. And with Nikki's body recovered, detectives could finally move on the suspect they'd been circling for months. For her family, it was the moment hope broke under the weight of truth. For investigators, it was the moment the case gained its most important witness, the evidence left behind. By the time the trial began in July 2021, the story of Nikki Kuhnhausen had already spread far beyond Vancouver. The courtroom was packed. Family, friends, reporters and members of the LGBTQ+ community, who had followed every development. This was more than just a murder trial. For many, it was a test of whether the justice system could truly see Nikki for who she was, and acknowledge why she was killed. Prosecutors began with the heart of their case, that Nikki's death was no accident, no momentary lapse of judgment, but an intentional act, fueled by prejudice. They laid out the timeline piece by piece, the ride in the van, the argument, the disappearance, the recovery of her body on Larch Mountain. They told the jury that when David Bogdanov discovered Nikki was transgender, his reaction was not confusion, but rage. And that rage, they argued, led him to strangle her, discard her body in the forest, and go on with his life as if nothing had happened. The defense countered with a very different story. They admitted David was shocked by Nikki's gender identity, but claimed he acted in self-defense. They argued he feared for his safety, suggesting Nikki had reached for something, and that in the heat of the moment, he reacted instinctively.
Push her back towards the passenger's door, and they just start freaking out, saying, I'm sorry if I cussed, but I was saying, what the fuck? What is this? You didn't tell me you're a dude. And started yelling at her said she's a disgusting piece of crap. She lunges at me and hits me across the face.
Okay. And then how do you react?
I shove her kind of hard. I'm trying to push her back to her driver's seat, and I keep telling her to just get the fuck out of my car.
Okay. Then what does she do?
When she hit the passenger's door with her back, when I shoved her, she kind of picked up her foot and tried to just kick me with her foot from the passenger side. And at that time, I tried to swipe her feet so that she doesn't hit me in the face, and I block her feet and I put them down into the footwell. And at that time, when I put them down, she just jumps up and goes towards the center console, towards my gun. At this point, the overwhelming feeling and thought was like a fight or flight mode just kicks in.
Of events that leaned on what's known as the panic defense. The idea that a revelation about someone's gender identity or sexual orientation could provoke a violent response. In many places, this tactic has been used to seek reduced sentences, or even acquittals. But in Washington state, that argument would meet a shifting legal landscape. In the time since Nikki's death, activists had pushed for, and won, a new law that banned the use of panic defense in court. It was named after her, Nikki's Law. And while the defense could still describe David's emotional reaction, they could no longer argue that it justified what happened next. Over the course of the trial, jurors heard from forensic experts, cell tower analysts, and friends who described Nikki's last known hours. They saw the cord recovered from the crime scene. They read the messages between Nikki and David, and the gaps where her replies stopped. And they listened to Nikki's mother, who took the stand and spoke not about the case, but about the daughter she'd lost. Her voice broke as she described the kitchen table talks, the laughter, and the dreams Nikki had for her future. After days of testimony, the case went to the jury. The deliberations stretched on for hours, the weight of the decision heavy in the quiet of the courthouse. When they returned, the room fell silent. David Bogdanov was found guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of malicious harassment, Washington's hate crime statute. The verdict was read aloud, each word a final rejection of the defense's claims. At sentencing, the judge looked directly at David before delivering 234 months in prison, nearly 20 years. It wasn't the maximum possible, but it was enough to ensure he would spend much of his life behind bars. In the gallery, Nikki's mother held a photo of her daughter. Tears ran down her face, a mixture of grief, relief, and the ache of knowing justice, no matter how thorough, would never bring Nikki home. Justice doesn't bring them back, but it can speak their truth. For Nikki Kuhnhausen, that truth now lives not just in the memories of those who loved her, but in the law itself. Months after the verdict, the governor of Washington sat at a long wooden desk, surrounded by lawmakers, advocates, and Nikki's family. Her mother held a framed photo, the same photo she'd carried through every court hearing, every press conference. A pen moved across paper, the strokes deliberate, final. With that signature, Nikki's law became official. Washington joined a growing list of states that banned the so-called panic defense, a tactic once used to excuse or lessen sentences for violence against LGBTQ+ people. In this state, it could never be used again. For some, it was a victory. For others, it was a promise that Nikki's death would mean something beyond the grief it left behind. Her friends speak of her still in the present tense, as if she's just stepped into another room. They talk about her laugh, her fearless style, the way she could make you feel like you'd known her for years. They talk about the life she should have had, and the change she left behind. In the end, her story became more than a tragedy. It became a line in the law, a barrier against the same excuse that once allowed prejudice to hide in plain sight. And for as long as that law stands, so will her truth. For more stories where the truth fights back, subscribe. Because the next case might just change the law again.